Okay, I'd like to return to Yellowstone plants today and expand our discussion and review our discussion of the conifers that we left off in our last module. So as we look at the Yellowstone conifers again, one of the major distinctions would be whether they have a berry-like cone or a non-berry-like cone. So those that have the berry-like cone then would be the junipers. And as you may recall, again, this is kind of what the juniper berry looks like. And so when I talk about cones, by the way, here I'm talking about the female cones. So the female cones here are more berry-like than scale-like and dry-like. And then again, the other side would be kind of the non-succulent cones, a typical kind of cone, and that would be either a pine, spruce, or a fir. And so again, I think I showed you some examples of cones last time, and I'll come back to those. But again, when I'm talking about a non-succulent cone, it's just the more typical kind of pine cone that you're used to thinking about or seeing and experiencing. And so again, that would be the pines, spruces, and firs. So as we look at the junipers then have, if they have a scale-like leaf and it's a tree in the Yellowstone ecosystem, then that's going to be a Rocky Mountain juniper. And then if the leaves are more needle-like, and it's a shrub, that's the mountain or common juniper. And again, we tend to find the junipers in areas that are a little drier. Some of the areas a little bit east of the Teton Range, for example, is a place where I've encountered a lot of both mountain junipers and Rocky Mountain junipers. Also on exposed slopes in some of the canyons. Now, for pines, spruces, and firs, if we have single needles, then that's going to be a spruce or a fir. And if the needles are in fascicles, and so again, that would be the single needles. And then if the needles are in fascicles or bundles, then it's going to be some type of a pine. And remember, a fascicle then would be a bundle of needles. And we're going to, in the Yellowstone ecosystem, we only see fascicles of 5 needles or 2 needles. So getting back to our single needle variety then, so if they're single needles, if they're square in cross section and sharp at the tips, and here we're talking more about the mature trees. The young trees, it's sometimes hard to tell, but in the more mature trees, that would tell you that it's a spruce. And then if the needles are flat in cross section and relatively dull at the tip, then we're talking about a fir. So coming back to the spruces then, spruces tend to have cones that are greater than, if a spruce has a cone that is greater than 3 inches, so again, this would be single needles, square and cross section that are sharp, but very large cones, and that's going to be the blue spruce. And the blue spruce is one of the, really the largest tree. It'll grow to be the tallest tree in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And then again, if it has the same kind of needle, but the cones are less than 3 inches, then it's an Engelmann spruce. And again, last time I showed you the contrast between the blue spruce cones and the Engelmann spruce cones. So sometimes, you know, to really identify these kind of trees, you have to be able to get to the cones too. So this would be the blue spruce here on the left and the Engelmann spruce on the right. And the spruces we tend to find, at least I have encountered them mostly in the Teton Range. And as you look at Teton Range, what you can't see from the valley floor is that there are lots of canyons which move up here. There are a lot of creeks which drain down through these canyons. And it's lining those canyons, especially as you get up in some of the higher elevations where you'll begin to encounter the different types of spruces. And again, the blue spruce will eventually be the dominant tree in these particular ecosystems. So then looking at the firs then, again, having brown cones with distinctive trident bracts that kind of hang down, that would be the Douglas fir. And so I didn't really get to show you this in the last module, and I do want to show you these kind of cones. So the Douglas fir cone, again, is pretty unique. I think I'm going to zoom up a little bit on this. But in addition to the sporophylls, you know, again, they have these little bract-like structures which stick out, and they're 3 pronged. So we refer to that as a trident-like bract. So again, in the Yellowstone ecosystem at least, this is a very unique type of cone. When you see that cone, you know you're dealing with the Douglas fir. And we tend to find the Douglas fir, again, in some of the lower elevations, usually find them in kind of a mixed conifer area. And then the other kind of distinctive fir up here will be the subalpine fir, which I've normally encountered almost on sheer canyon walls. And the subalpine fir has these purple cones that stand erect, so very distinctive compared to the Douglas fir, and it would be hard to confuse those two. And then getting back to our pines then, pines can either have 2 needles per pascal or 5 needles per pascal. The 2 needles per pascal, that would be the lodgepole pine. Lodgepole pine, again, as far as the general ecosystem is concerned, is really the dominant tree in the ecosystem. In the lodgepole pine, and I would say conifers in general are adapted to poor soils. And among the conifers that we see in the Yellowstone ecosystem, the lodgepole pine is best adapted to the porous soils. So as you move up into the Yellowstone Park, then you tend to see more and more lodgepoles. And part of that is due to the fact that there's this rhyolitic soil, which is kind of a poor quality soil. And the lodgepoles do best in that particular soil. And so they eventually will dominate in ecosystems that may start out as mixed conifers. And then the other pines that we encounter in the ecosystem will have 5 needles per pascal, and those will either be limber pines or white bark pines. And the differences there is, again, that they will have 5 needles per pascal. And the limber pines will have relatively large cones, and they'll be either green or brown. So the female cones start off kind of greenish, eventually end up brown, and they'll be 3.5 inches or longer. And then the white bark pine, the cones are actually purple, much like that subalpine fir that we just saw a couple of minutes ago. And the cones will tend to be smaller, usually less than 3.5 inches. And so limber pines and white bark pines we also tend to find in areas where there's a lot of wind. We'll find those in canyons. Also, the white bark in particular likes really high altitudes, and so at the high altitudes it'll also be very windy. So both of those pines are interesting because they have very, very flexible branches, and that's where the term for the limber pine comes from. But they really don't break very easily. And we'll be talking about the white bark pine later, because the white bark pine in particular at these high elevations is a very important food source for the grizzly bear. And this is an important problem really in grizzly management, because even though grizzlies have been delisted, there's a lot of risks for the grizzly bears in the future, and one of them is the white bark pine population. With global warming, the white bark pines are being devastated by pine beetles, and those populations are expected to disappear in the next 5 to 15 years. And that's a major food source for the grizzlies as they prepare for hibernation. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. Also, just going back to the lodgepole pine as well. Again, it's the dominant conifer in the Yellowstone Park in particular, and throughout a lot of that ecosystem. And again, it does have a particular adaptation that is a fire adaptation. So fires are typical in this area, and so about 1/3 of the cones of the lodgepole pine will never open completely. They'll never disseminate their seeds. They're actually sealed by resin. And so it actually requires fire to melt that resin and open those cones up, which allowed them to disperse their seeds. And again, there's kind of a balance there, because if the fire has to be hot enough to melt that resin and open up the cone. But if it's too hot, it will literally burn the cone or burn the seeds, and that's not going to do any good at all. So it depends on how hot the fire is as to whether these seeds will be disseminated and start the next generation. Okay. All right. So next, I want to move into really what is, in terms of numbers of species, the dominant group of plants, which would be the flowering plants, the Angiosperms, subkingdom Angiospermi, and within that the division Anthophyta. So the Anthophyta or Angiosperms we're going to be using synonymously here, and those refer to the flowering plants. So we'll see some similarities in the life cycle with the conifers, but there are a couple of important differences. So as we look at the division Anthophyta, then these are the flowering plants, and again, seed-producing plants. And here the seeds will develop within a fruit. And the fruit is derived from the ovary of a flower, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Flowering plants also practice something called double fertilization that we'll get to in a second. And another way of defining double fertilization is that their endosperm is a triploid endosperm. So instead of a haploid endosperm, they have a triploid endosperm. So we're still going to be working within our general life cycle here, but again, we're going to be interested in the nuances then that make the flowering plants unique. So flowering plants have flowers. They don't always look like this particular flower, but that's one of the characteristics of the group. And so as we look at structures of the flower, there are the reproductive organs. And so the male reproductive organ is composed of an anther and a filament, and that's known as the stamen. And so in particular, the anther is where the pollen grains are going to be produced, and I'll come back to that in just a second. The female reproductive organ is known as the carpel, also called the pistil. And there's three parts to that. The stigma is the upper part of the carpel or pistil. There's usually a thinner region, neck-like region known as the style, and then an enlarged region known as the ovary. And within the ovary, this is where one or more ovules will develop. And you may recall when we talked about conifers that a single ovule will generate a single seed. So within the ovary then, seeds develop. And the walls of the ovary will develop into the fruit that house the seed. So again, that's a characteristic of the group. Flowering plants produce seeds within a fruit. Fruits are derived from the ovary of a flower. So those are the two reproductive organs, the stamen and the pistil or the carpel. And then there are additional structures that we call accessory structures. Those include the petals. And so the petals typically are pigmented. And one of the roles of the petals is to attract pollinators. So one of the differences that we're going to see between the flowering plants and do see between flowering plants and the conifers is that whereas conifers generally wind pollinate, most of the flowering plants, instead of wind pollinating, use pollinators. So they'll use insects like butterflies, honeybees, or other types of bees, sometimes beetles, ants, other insects, to transport pollen from one flower to another. Could also be hummingbirds. In some areas it would be bats, although not in the Yellowstone ecosystem. So again, those would be the petals, and collectively we refer to the petals as the corolla of the flower. So when you're trying to figure out what type of plant you're looking at, a lot of times they'll describe a corolla composed of so many petals. And then encapsulating what initially is a flower bud will be sepals, and these are usually leaf-like structures. Sometimes they're pigmented, but usually they're green. And collectively the sepals are known as the calyx. And then another term that's used is the perianth, and the perianth includes the calyx and the corolla. So all of the sepals and all of the corolla combined we refer to as the perianth. And then the ovary sits on, or sometimes is embedded in, what we refer to as the receptacle of the flower, which is basically the base of the flower. All right, so let's see how these structures then relate to the life cycle. And again, just emphasize too that the ovary develops into a fruit. So any structure that has seeds within it would be a fruit. So some things that we kind of consider, vegetables, like a tomato, some people call tomatoes a vegetable, that's botanically a fruit because it has seeds within and it is derived from the ovary of a flower. And sometimes fruits don't look very fruit-like. They can be dry and not very appetizing in appearance. All right, so again, let's get back to this life cycle and go ahead and look at how flowering plants reproduce. So we're going to first start with the anther. We'll look at the male reproductive organ. And so within the anther then, sporangia develop or are produced. And within the sporangia, microspores develop. And these are the immature pollen grains. And the microspores will develop into microgametophytes, which are the mature pollen grains. And so this is a cross-section through an anther. So these would be the sporangia. And then within, the immature and mature pollen grains are developing. So it's within the sporangia then that meiosis will occur. This is all diploid tissue, part of the sporophyte. And again, flowering plants are sporophyte dominant. So when you look at a flowering plant, you're looking at the sporophyte. And so within the sporangia, meiosis occurs and we'll get pollen grains developing. And again, it's the same kind of idea that we talked about before. If there's a single nucleus, that would be a microspore, immature pollen grain. And then if that nucleus undergoes a mitotic division, that would be a microgametophyte. So again, single nucleus, microspore, two nuclei, microgametophyte. And so it's not until they have those two nuclei that we consider that a mature pollen grain, and that's a pollen grain capable of carrying out the next step in the life cycle. All right, now meanwhile then, within the carpel of the flower, within the ovary of the flower, one or more ovules will develop. And so within the ovule will develop a megasporangium, a megaspore. So a single megaspore will form. And then that megaspore will undergo mitotic division to generate a megagametophyte. So the megagametophyte will be within the ovule, within the ovary of the pistil of the flower, of the carpel of the flower. And again, this is a complete oxymoron in a sense because megagametophyte means the big gametophyte, but in the flowering plants, the megagametophyte is composed of only 8 cells. It's very, very small, and again, it's going to be housed within that female reproductive organ. And we're only going to be really interested in 3 of those 8 cells. One of those 8 cells will be an ovum, and 2 of those cells are what we call polar nuclei. And those are all haploid cells because they're part of the gametophyte. So the ovum is housed within the ovule, within the ovary. The pollen grain, of course, is in the anther. So first of all, the pollen grains have to somehow get to the ovary. And again, that can be wind pollinated. There are some species of flowering plants that use wind. But more typically, a pollinator will carry pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the pistil of a flower. And then once there, just as in the conifers a pollen tube formed, the same thing happens in the flowering plant. So the pollen grains will then begin to elongate because they need to get from the stigma of the flower down to the ovule where the ovum is. So they have to grow down there. So again, there are going to be 2 nuclei, a tube nucleus, a generative nucleus, just as we had in the conifers. And so as the tube elongates and makes its way down to the ovule, what will happen is that the generative nucleus will divide to produce 2 sperm nuclei. So this is looking at a cross-section of a lilium ovary. So again, this is the ovary. Here's our ovule. And then we have the megagametophyte inside of the ovules. A closer view, again, looking at the ovule, megagametophyte inside. And this is actually at a 4-cell stage. They would undergo one more set of divisions, get to the 8 cells. So again, the tube nucleus is going to control extension of the tube. The generative nucleus will divide to produce 2 sperm nuclei, and they eventually grow down and get to the ovule and where the megagametophyte is. So the tube grows down. What's going to happen is the tube nucleus is going to die. Then we have 2 sperm nuclei. One of the sperm nuclei will fuse with the ovum to produce a zygote. And here the other sperm nucleus will fuse with the 2 polar nuclei to form a triploid cell. And that triploid cell will divide to form the endosperm of the developing seed. So in the conifers, you may recall only one of the 2 sperm functioned. In the flowering plants, they both have a function. One will fuse with the ovum in the actual reproduction and generate a zygote, which will eventually divide to form an embryo. And the other sperm nucleus will fuse with the polar nuclei to generate a triploid cell, a 3N cell. So again, that's unique. And so we refer to that as double fertilization. I don't really love the term, but that's the term that we use because both sperm end up fusing with something else. So again, a zygote will form, and then we end up with this triploid cell, 1 set of chromosomes from the sperm and 2 sets of chromosomes from the 2 different polar nuclei. So again, kind of summarizing the process, the tube grows, the generative nucleus will divide into 2 sperm nuclei. And then those sperm nuclei, or excuse me, those nuclei, the tube nucleus will die. 1 sperm nucleus will fuse with the ovum to yield a zygote. And then the zygote will divide mitotically to form the embryo of the seed. And so that embryo then will be the baby plant of the next generation. And then the other sperm nucleus will fuse with the 2 polar nuclei, so N plus N plus N will yield a triploid cell, and it will mitotically divide to form the endosperm of the seed. And you may recall that the endosperm provides nutrients to the embryo as it begins to grow. And then the remainder of the ovule will form seed coats, so we'll have diploid seed coats around the seed. And again, embryo, endosperm, and seed coats gives us our seed. And if it's lucky enough to be disseminated in the right way, it has a chance to grow into the new plant. So as we look at seed structure then, again, we have the embryo. And in the embryonic structure, there's also a structure called a cotyledon. And this is significant. I'll come back to that in a second. We also have endosperm, which provides the nutrients. We're going to have seed coats, which are protective. Now, the cotyledon is significant here because this also affects classification, the number of cotyledons. And the role of the cotyledon is, again, the cotyledon is actually a portion of the embryo, but it becomes the interface between the embryo and the endosperm. So the cotyledons will absorb nutrients from the endosperm and then deliver that to the rest of the embryo so that it can begin to grow and elongate. And again, the seed coat or testa is just protective. Usually that has to be scarred in some way or damaged in some way so that water can move in and initiate growth. So for some types of seeds, it's really important that they actually be damaged by fire in some cases, or some seeds will be more likely to germinate if they're eaten by an animal and partially digested by the animal. And then after they're defecated, they may have a better chance of germinating than they would if that didn't happen. So again, this would be the fruit out here, and then we have the seeds inside of a fruit. And again, that's the last aspect of this. Seeds housed within the fruit, and the fruit develops from the ovary of the flower. All right, so within the division Anthophyta, then we have two classes. One are the monocots, monocotyledonii, and class dicotyledonii, the dicots, sometimes called the eudicots. And basically this refers to the number of cotyledons there are. So if there's a single cotyledon that acts as an interface for absorbing nutrients from the endosperm, that would be a monocot. So it really comes down to the seed structure here, or embryo structure. And then the dicots, the prefix di means two, and so this would be a seed that has two cotyledons, or an embryo that has two cotyledons. And one that we would eat a lot, actually, any bean or pea, if you've ever can separate a seed into two parts, then you're looking at a dicot. Now, it's not always easy to get access to the seed, so there are other characteristics that we can look at in trying to decide if we're looking at a monocot or a dicot. So again, if you have the seed, a single cotyledon is monocot, two cotyledons is dicot. But you can also look at the venation of a leaf. So if the veins are parallel, we would consider that's typical of a monocot. If we have kind of a netted type venation, then that's more typical of a dicot. If you look at stem venation, scattered vascular bundles is typical of a monocot, whereas vascular tissues in a ring, distribution, that's typical of a dicot. And then the roots, if you have a fibrous root system, that's typical of monocots, whereas if you have a central taproot and then fibrous roots coming off of that, that's more typical of a dicot. So monocots, again, fibrous. Taproot would be dicots. And then pollen grains, if you're lucky enough to get access to a pollen grain, if there's a single opening in the pollen grain, that's it's typical of monocots. 3 openings, typical of dicots. And then also flower parts. And by this we mean petals, sepals, stamens, and sometimes even pistils themselves. If they're in multiples of 3, that's typical of monocots. If we see those in multiples of 4s or 5s, that's more typical of dicots. Also, as we look at plant structure, again, this also will help us in classification, and we'll talk about some major plant families a little bit later in our next module. But again, root structure can play a role in classification, and that would be the root system. The part of the plant above the ground we would consider the shoot system. So we have stem, we have leaves. When we look at the leaves, there's the blade, also the petiole. And so the arrangement of those, venation, can be significant. And then also when we have a side branch or a leaf coming off, we refer to that as a node off of a stem. And the region between side branches would be internodes. And then also flower position or bud position can be significant. So you can have what we call apical buds, and we can also have what we call axillary buds, which come off kind of in the area, the angle between where a side branch comes off or a petiole comes off. And also, it always also gets back to remember when we define root and stem, part of that has to do with distribution of vascular tissues. So again, plants have different adaptations. So just because something is above ground doesn't necessarily mean it is a stem, and just because it's below ground doesn't mean it's necessarily a root. So the term rhizome, for example, is a reference to an underground stem. There are a lot of plants that have underground stems. Aspen would be a kind of a classic example of that. There are some types of plants that have bulbs. Bulb-type plants are storing nutrients underground in leaves. And so the bulb actually is a modified leaf bud. And so instead of storing nutrients in the roots, they'll store them in leaves underground. A stolon is a horizontal stem growing above ground. And again, there's some types of plants that do that. And then a tuber would just be a large storage area, typically on a root. But we'll see various examples of that, throughout the ecosystem. Okay, also as we look at flowers again, with an eye towards trying to classify, flowers can be described as regular or irregular. So a regular flower is one that basically has a circular plan. It has what we call radial symmetry, and by that we mean it has more than one plane of symmetry, and a plane of symmetry will generate roughly into mirror images. So if there are multiple planes of symmetry, we refer to that as radial symmetry. So that would be a regular flower. An irregular flower would be one that has only a single plane of symmetry. This is Western's monkshood, and this would be an example of that. So again, it's not really circular in body plan. There's only one plane that will give us mirror images, so that would be an irregular flower. Other flowers we described as either complete or incomplete. A complete flower is one that really has all of the parts that we've discussed. So a complete flower will have petals, it will have sepals, it will have stamens, and it will have pistils or carpels. And so if all of those parts are present, we refer to that as a complete flower. If it lacks one or more of those, it would be an incomplete flower. And then also a perfect flower would be one that has both reproductive organs, stamens and carpels or pistils. That would be perfect. And an imperfect flower would lack either stamens or pistils. And then also as we look at plants, and this isn't true just of the flowering plants, so this would be for plants in general, some plants we describe as being monoecious, others as dioecious. And so a monoecious plant is a plant that has both sex organs on the same plant. So male and female organs on the same plant. And dioecious would be separate sexes. So again, some plants will have flowers, a single flower that has combined sexes. Others will have male flowers and female flowers. And again, some plants will have only one type of flower, and other plants will have the other sex of the flower. So again, we're going to talk about a few of the families of flowering plants, but again, there's extraordinary diversity here, so I'm not going to be able to show you all of the different types of flowering plants. So I'm trying to lay a little bit of the foundation first of the life cycle, then some of the structures so that when you go to the ecosystem and you're trying to key out what kind of plant you're looking at, you'll have some of the skills to be able to do that. So that does it for today. I'll continue this discussion next time.